Hello everyone, today we're going to be working on this cat eye and the white fur around it. I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to start by lightly rubbing out the pencil marks with the Tombow Mono Eraser, just so they don't look as harsh showing through the coloured pencil. And we're just going to be focusing on the eye for now, and then we'll move on to the fur. Just leaving enough of a mark so we can still see where to add the coloured pencil. And I'm starting off by using the lighter version of the reference photo, just so that I can see those details a bit better within the eye. And I can see around the eye, it's kind of like a cooler, very dark blue-grey. It's probably almost black on the original version, but I'm going to go in with the Polychromos pencil first, the Paynes grey, sorry, in the Polychromos range. And making sure my pencil's nice and sharp, as it's quite a fine kind of line around the eye. I'm just working around the eye, following that pencil mark underneath as a guide. And I'm using a lighter pressure to begin with, just to create a very fine marking around the eye. Just going back over it a little bit just to make it slightly thicker in the inner part of that eye there. And then also around the inner edge. In fact, that's actually the inner part of the eye there. I've just kind of made a bit of an outline of where that blue tone is around the inner part. Now this is actually more of a warm tone here, in the very inner corner. So we're just going to very lightly mark that out, but then we'll go in with a more of a warm tone afterwards. And then I'm just bringing that around the top. And again, that's more of a warm tone just above it. And then whilst I'm here, I'm also going to map out the pupil. And I'm making sure to keep that area free where the reflection is. Now, even though the pupil looks black, even on the lighter version of the reference photo, I think I'm going to fill it in first with the dark indigo pencil, as it's kind of still got that very deep blue kind of tone to it. And then after we've used this, we can use a black on top. I just kind of want to fill this in with the dark indigo first. I'm using a light to medium pressure to begin with, as I want to build those layers gradually. Don't worry about those reflections at the moment, as we can kind of bring those out later on. I do tend to like to make areas darker and then bring the highlights in over the top. I find that works really well, rather than kind of leaving a big space where the reflections are and then just adding the colour on top. Sorry, underneath. I like to kind of blend it into the darker area, if that makes sense. I will show you anyway what I mean once I've had the reflections in on top. And there's some kind of darker reflections as well towards the top that you can see a bit better in the lighter version of the photo. Now for blue toned eyes like this, I would normally start with a lighter blue kind of grey tone. So I would usually use the Luminance Silver Grey, but I have just found the Derwent Lightfast Arctic, which I haven't actually used before, or I haven't in a long time anyway. And I feel like this would work really well. This is kind of like a bright, very bright light blue. And I'm using this in the iris area. I've just switched back to the original version of the reference photo for now. But yeah, the silver grey will work just fine if you've got that pencil. I'm just using this as a base tone for the iris, using a light to medium pressure. And it's pretty subtle. As you can see, it's a very light pencil. You almost can't really see it. Now that's covered, I'm just going to start introducing some kind of blue tones into the eye. So I think I'm going to start with the Polychromos Light Cobalt Turquoise, and I'm going to use this around the iris very lightly to build those layers up gradually. So I can see there's kind of like that light blue turquoisey type colour. And it's a lot more blue right around the iris. I may add a slightly different tone and some deeper blues afterwards, but for now, I want to keep building up to those darker colours. I'm using circular motions as I shade in, as I just find this helps to kind of create that texture of the iris. The textured look rather than obviously it's not textured, but you've got all those different patterns in there, so it kind of helps to use circular motions, as it almost forms a slight pattern in itself. I'm very lightly bringing it out into the outwards from the centre. Then I'm going to take more of a blue grey tone pencil. This is the Pablo Grey. Now you can use the Luminance Paynes Grey 30% or another kind of blue grey pencil you have in your own set. And I'm just going to work around the edges here, as they're not quite as bright and pigmented blue. It's more of that kind of subtle grey tone. Again, using a light to medium pressure, but taking the pressure off a bit as I come into the eye. And again, using circular motions. Don't worry about those detailed patterns at the moment. We'll add those in a bit later on. I'm just kind of shading in and getting in those main tones for now. And also working around the around the top of the eye, sorry. Using a slightly heavier pressure as it's quite dark here and in shadow. And then it is quite a bit warmer on this side of the iris, but I want to add that cool tone in first, using a bit of a lighter pressure, and then we can add in some of those warmer tones afterwards. And then also around the iris slightly. Now I know the eye appears blue, but I do see a very slight hint of light green in there as well. So I'm going to use the Luminance Middle Verdigris, which is that kind of perfect kind of green that I can see in the eye. And I'm just using a very light pressure just to glaze over and add that very slight hint of green that I can see coming through. And I'm working mainly around the iris and in the centre kind of area. Leaving it a little bit lighter there. I think for that area, I'm going to use the Luminance Light Cobalt Blue. So this is kind of like a brighter blue, but still not super pigmented. So it should work well for this area here. And again, I'm using a light to medium pressure, lessening the pressure as I work into that much brighter area there. And then also working on this side here, kind of using this to blend those layers down. And once we have a nice smooth layer, we can start adding in some finer details over the top. Before we continue adding details to the iris, I just want to go back over that pupil. And I'm using the Polychromos black now, using more of a medium to heavy pressure. Just so we don't lose sight of that outline as we build up those darker details around the pupil. And then I'm lessening the pressure a little at the top where it's a little bit lighter, but it is still quite dark. So I'm still going to go over it with the black pencil. I'm just using, kind of just shading it into that reflection, but keeping that area free for now. Using the same pencil, I'm just going to go around the top using a lighter pressure. Switching back to the original version, just so I can see those patterns a bit better around the pupil. I'm going to take the dark indigo pencil we used for the pupil And I'm going to start adding in those detailed patterns around the pupil. So I'm just going to give that a quick sharpen. Now we want a nice fine point for this, as those details are quite intricate. And I'm just starting to bring out some of those intricate pattern details out from the iris, kind of creating lines going in different directions, but kind of curving upwards and out into the center of the iris. And I'm just using a light to medium pressure to begin with. I'd say more of a medium pressure actually. Working around this reflection there. And then bringing some of them up and around. Just keeping a close look at that reference photo to make sure we're kind of creating that pattern correctly. Don't worry, it doesn't need to be completely the same, as long as we're kind of getting an idea of how it looks. And then I'm kind of just shading in the top there where it's quite a bit dark and you can't really see because of the shadow. Also working around the edge to add a slight touch of that darker blue. But again, it's more of a blue-grey, so I'm not adding too much this colour. To add a touch more of that kind of intense blue colour around the iris, I'm using the Polychromos Prussian blue. And I'm just kind of glazing it over right around the outer edge of the pupil. And around that reflection there. Just to add a bit more of that kind of intense blue colour. And then around the edge here, I can see it's kind of got a purple grey kind of tone to it. So I'm using the Luminance Violet Grey. And I'm just shading over that inner corner area using a light to medium pressure and circular motions. Just to add that kind of purpley blue-grey kind of tone on this side. Bringing it out slightly into the iris there, but not too much. And I'm also just going to add a very slight hint of that here, not bringing that out as much as we did on this side though. And around the top. And a little around the bottom there. Then just using the sky blue, which is a bit more of a subtle blue, just working that into that area just to bring out a bit more of that blue tone. This is a bit of a softer blue, so it works well for this corner area. Using a medium pressure to shade in. Adding a little bit of that at the top there. And then I want to add in a little bit of that warmer tone around the outer edge there. So I think I'm going to take the Warm Earth 40%. And I'm just going to shade that in to the outer edge using a light to medium pressure. adding in that hint of warmth, and then it kind of looks more of that kind of peachy pink tone as it comes down. Just bringing that all the way up there. And so I think I'm going to take the Polychromos Cinnamon, but you could also use the Luminance Burnt Ochre 10%, or the Herculanum Red, or even the Burnt Sienna 10% would work okay as well. I'm just going to add a touch of that coming down, not bringing it all the way to the bottom. To work back around the edge, just to sharpen things up before we continue adding detail, I'm using the Polychromos Paynes Grey, working back around that edge, using more of a medium to heavy pressure now. Just really neatening up the edges. On this side. And then I'm also just going to use this pencil to kind of shade into those shadowed areas. So I'm creating a little bit of detail here, and then I'm kind of just shading in and blocking in that shadow. And if we need to add in a little bit more detail over the top with a dark, maybe a black pencil, we can. But I just want to block in that shadowed area around the top. Don't worry about that reflection for now, as we're going to work on that afterwards. And like I said, we can always bring lighter areas over the top. I might actually just shade it into that top part there. And then I'm also starting to add in some darker details around this edge, where it's a bit more of that grey kind of blue. Adding in those veins, vessels in the eye. You want to make sure your pencil is nice and sharp for that. Adding a little bit of detail on this side here. Using a lighter pressure as we come down into that lighter area. Then going back in with the light Cobalt Turquoise we used earlier, I'm just going to add another very light layer into the centre, just to add a touch more of that blue back into the eye. That blue kind of green colour. Bringing it up slightly there, but still keeping it a little bit lighter on this side. And I'm also just shading it into the reflection there. And then using the light Cobalt Blue, just shading over that reflection. And then we're going to bring it out a little bit more afterwards. And really add some details into that area. Okay, so for the reflection, I'm going to use a sharp white Museum Aquarelle pencil, because those lighter parts, it's kind of got like those stripes going down. So for the lighter areas, I want to use the white pencil, and then I will add in the blue details in between. So using a medium to heavy pressure, I'm adding in that reflection. Now it might not show up as bright as we'd like it to, but we can always kind of go in with the white Uni Posca pen afterwards if needed. So just to brighten that a little more, I'm using the white Uni Posca pen. I'm going back over those stripes, using a very gentle pressure, just to add a touch of that in there. And then using the Prussian blue, I'm just going to give that a quick sharpen. Just working in between those lighter areas using a very light pressure. As this is a bit of a darker pencil and I don't want to make it super pigmented. And then I'm also just going to work into the into the pupil, just to add that kind of blue around it. Switching back to the lighter version of the reference photo just so that we can see a bit better. And then just working around the reflection there, just to neaten it up a bit and make it a little bit sharper. And then using the light Cobalt Turquoise, I would usually use a luminance pencil to go over the top, but this should work okay. And I'm just going to brighten. In fact, that's not quite as light as I'd like it to be. I'm just going to use the light Cobalt Blue from the luminance range, as it goes over the top of the darker areas a bit better. Although it's not quite as turquoisey as I'd like it to be, and I'm just bringing that into the over the top of the pupil ever so slightly. And then to sharpen the pupil again, I'm going in with the Polychromos black, going back around the edges, using a slightly less of a pressure there, just as there's a very slight hint of reflection. I'm actually just going to use the light Cobalt Blue, and I'm just going to go over that ever so slightly just to add that very slight hint of reflection. You can actually only really see this in the lighter version of the reference photo, but I just want to enhance that a bit more. And then going back in with the black just to refine areas, using a heavier pressure. And I'm also using the black just to add some dark details in the shadowed area around the top, creating lines coming out. And I'm using the lighter version of the reference photo to see this a little bit better. To add that touch of grey I can see around the centre of the iris, I'm using the Cold Grey 234 just to darken up those details that are a bit more grey toned, using a medium to heavy pressure, keeping it kind of in the centre of the iris area and keeping that area there a bit lighter. Kind of working in the direction of the patterns as I do this. And then kind of shading in from the top. Going in with the dark indigo pencil and again creating dark details coming out from the iris, using a medium to heavy pressure, using a much heavier pressure as I work right around the iris, then lessening the pressure as I add in those details in the centre. Going back over the pupil again just to really deepen that blue tone. And I think I'm going to leave the eye there for now, and if there's any details we want to go back and add in, we can do that afterwards. So I'm going to make a start on this, on the fur right around the eye, and then we can always come back to the eye afterwards. So I'm using the Tombow Mono Eraser again just to gently lift some of that pigment from the pencil. Leaving just enough of a mark so we can still see where to add that detail. Now I want to start right around the eye, and I can see that it's more of like a warm beigey pink kind of tone. So I could either start with a warm grey or a pink colour, but I think I'm going to start with the Polychromos Beige Red, which is kind of like a peachy pink, very light peachy pink. And I'm just using a light pressure to gently work around the eye. And it's a lot more kind of muted, like a cool grey around this area. But we can go in with a cool grey pencil over the top afterwards. Just working right around the eye. Definitely more cool toned as we come around the front, the bottom. So I'm just lessening the pressure as I bring it towards the bottom there. To add in that cool grey around the inner corner and around the bottom, I'm using the the Cold Grey 230. And I'm just shading in using a light to medium pressure, working in that inner corner first and then around the outside. And around the bottom. I feel like there's a very slight hint of blue around the very bottom there, but we can add that in a bit later on. And I'm just bringing this up a little as it's kind of like a mix of warm and cool tone. And then for this top area, I'm going to use more of a warm grey. So I think I might use the Raw Umber 10%. And I'm just working into the very top part there using a medium pressure. I will go in with more of a pigmented kind of peachy tone afterwards as well, just to bring that out a bit more. Using a slight touch of this just around here, where it's a bit warmer as it comes out into the fur. And then also just above there. Taking the Polychromos Cinnamon, which is a bit of a darker version of the beige red, should we say. And I'm just working back over the top there where it's a lot darker. I will then go in with an even darker pencil just to really get that shadow above the eye. But I want to build those layers up gradually. And I'm using a medium-ish, light to medium pressure here, taking the pressure off as I come down. And then just to define that inner corner a bit more, I'm going to use the Cold Grey 234, which is a bit of a darker pencil, but not too dark, as I can see that it's kind of like a cold grey, but it's not a super dark grey. kind of like a mid-tone. So I'm just mapping that out there. Creating a bit of an outline of where that is. Bringing it around, connecting to the bottom there. And then just shading that in a little, right in the inner corner. You can see there's kind of like those little darker pattern details around the eye, like little dots of markings, but we can add those in once we've got more of those layers down. So to build up a bit of the fur around the eye before we finish adding the detail there, I can see we've got some warm kind of yellows, some greens, some very light hint of blues in certain areas. So I think I'm going to start with a lighter warm tone pencil. This is the Luminance Buff Titanium. I do usually like to start with a Luminance pencil just because they're nice and soft. They create a nice base to work over the top of. So I'm adding it into that kind of shadowed area of the fur, just to the right of the eye. And I'm just working in the direction of the fur, but I'm just focusing right in that corner area for now. So it's a little bit more cool toned as we come out. And then just around the bottom as well, coming out into the fur. Now I can also see some very slight hint of green, like around this area here. So I'm going to use the Luminance Middle Verdigris, which is the perfect kind of pencil for this, as it's that very kind of light green, subtle kind of green that works well for fur. And I'm using a light pressure just to glaze over that area there. And I'm just focusing on this area right around the eye for now. And then taking more of a cool tone pencil, this is the Luminance Silver Grey. I'm just going to give that a sharpen and then put it in my pencil extender. Sorry about the blurriness on the video here. I'm not sure why it's out of focus, but it's only for a few minutes, so hopefully you can still follow along okay. So I'm just using that in the cooler areas as I come out of that part there. Going over the top of those warmer tones and green tones we've just added as well. Bringing it round, also working just right around the bottom of the eye, but we will go in with a bit of a more of a blue-grey for that area there. And also working into that inner corner, just to add that touch of blue. Now taking a slightly darker cold grey pencil, this is the 232. Just working back into that shadowed area. Creating slightly more precise strokes, but still kind of just shading in at this point, and using a lighter pressure still. I will also go in with a warm grey pencil afterwards, so I can see some warm greys in there as well. And it doesn't really matter which order you go in, as long as you get those kind of undertones down initially. And then just around the top here, starting to create kind of like an idea of where those strokes are coming out from. Just kind of a suggestion. And then taking the Luminance Burnt Sienna 10%, which is more of like a earthy light pink, which will work well for the area around the eye. So working back around the eye, using more of a medium pressure. Just darkening that up a little. And taking the pressure off as I come towards the bottom there. And then also working in that inner corner. And around the top. So now I just want to define this area right around the top where it's kind of like a deep, reddy, warm kind of tone. So I'm going to take the Polychromos Caput Mortuum Violet. You could also use the Luminance Burnt Sienna, but I feel like I can get a bit more of a precise kind of detail with this pencil. And it's got that kind of slight purple brown tone to it as well, which would work well. So I'm just creating a fine line around the top of that. We can bring in some of those white hairs over the top so it doesn't look as rounded off and neat. A bit later on we'll do that. And I'm also just working around the very edge of the eye and then shading in using a lighter pressure. And I'm also just going to add a touch of that into that inner corner. So I can see there's kind of like a warm tone to it. Just using a light to medium pressure to go over that. Then whilst I'm here, I just want to define the eye, the top part of the eye a little more. So I'm using the Polychromos Black. I'm actually just going to give that a quick sharpen. And I'm just working back around the outline of the eye, just to add a bit more to that shadow. So I'm going around the outline using a medium pressure. Back around here. Creating a very fine line. And then I'm going to gently shade in. In fact, I'm just going to create some like darker details, and that'll create the look of a shadow around the top. So I just want to deepen it up a bit and create a bit more contrast between the reflection and the shadow. Just using a medium pressure. And then going around the very bottom. Again, keeping a light to medium pressure. Just defining the outline a little more. Even though I wouldn't say it's black around the bottom and around here, I can still use the black just to darken those shades that we've got down a little, as this isn't such a super pigmented black, so it kind of works just to darken areas as well. Now I'm just going to use the same pencil just to add in those little specks of detail around the inner corner of the eye. Almost like little freckles in the skin right around the eye. There. Now I also just want to add a very slight hint of kind of that warmer orange kind of tone I can see. So I'm using the Polychromos burnt ochre, and I'm just going around the top there just to add a bit more of that orange I can see, and then I'm lessening the pressure as I come down, so it's not quite as warm there. Then to add in that cool blue I can see around the bottom, I'm using the Polychromos Sky Blue, and I'm just adding this right around the bottom there, and then lessening the pressure as I come up. And then I'm going over that with the Paynes Grey 30%, and I'm just going to give that a quick sharpen. Lessening the pressure as I come up to the warmer part. And adding a touch of that here. And in the inner part of the eye there. And around the top. So now that we've got those initial kind of details in around the eye, I know there's still a few specks of detail to add around the eyelids. I just want to start mapping out those cooler and warmer areas in the rest of the fur. And then once we've got those in, we can work on the bulk of the fur and add in any final details to the area right around the eye. So I think I'm going to start with a warmer grey pencil. I want to start nice and light, so I'm going to use the warm grey 270 from the Polychromos range. And I'm starting with a blunt pencil, just as I find it easier to get those base tones down with a blunt pencil. And I'm just working around the eye here, so I can see some warm tones here, very roughly kind of mapping out where those slightly darker tones are. So I'm leaving the very lightest white parts in the fur for now, and I'm just getting in those kind of shadowed areas. And there are some cool tones. There's like a mix of cool tones here, but I'm just going in with a warm grey first. And you could even go in with a cool grey and it wouldn't really matter, as long as we get all those tones in and we work from light to dark using a light to medium pressure to begin with. I'm not being super precise at all, I'm just kind of roughly getting those, blocking in those areas. I'd say it's quite a bit cooler actually up here as the hair goes into the ear. It's quite a bit cooler here around the nose. I'm just going to add in some little hints of warmth there. There's quite a lot of white here, so I'm not adding too much. I'm just going to rub that pencil mark out there that's still a bit harsh. And then also just around the nose still. You can see that quite a bit there. Okay, so now using the Coal Grey 230, which is the lightest version of the Coal Grey pencils, I'm going over the top of those warm grey parts we just added. I'm shading in, but I'm making sure to work in the direction of the fur still, as this just helps to create like a natural flow. As we add in the details, it kind of all comes together a bit better if we work in the direction of the fur. And it doesn't matter if you add too much colour, as we can use the white pencil or the slice tool to go in and add in those white hairs afterwards. So don't worry about those white hairs for now. Just make sure to kind of keep the very lightest areas free so that we can add a layer of white down first. And in this area here, where the bridge of the nose is, I'm kind of just curving my pencil as it kind of goes in different directions. As we've got this part of the fur coming up this way, and then as we come down, it's going this way, so I'm kind of just curving my pencil in that direction. And because I'm working from the side, it's kind of hard to add in those strokes going towards the top. So I will turn my paper around, afterwards, just to get those bits in. Then just working around the nose here. So I think now I'm going to turn my paper around to add in these strokes going up here. Continuing with the Cold Grey 230, I'm just adding in those fur details going up towards the top. Now, before we continue adding into those shadowed areas, I just want to get a layer of white down first into the lighter areas, as I find this just helps to kind of create a nice white smooth layer, and then when we want to add detail on top we can, and it goes on a lot more smooth rather than using the white of the paper. So I'm just using the white Museum Acrylel, and I'm using a light to medium pressure to add in that layer of white. So obviously you can't really see this colour as it's white on top of white, but like I said, it just creates a nice smooth layer to work over the top of. And I'm working in the direction still of the fur as I do this. Creating longer strokes as I come out the side here. Around the bottom of the nose there, and on the bridge of the nose. Now we've got that down, I can continue going in and adding in those darker details. So taking a slightly darker cold grey pencil, this is the Cold Grey 232. We could use the Cold Grey 231, but I just thought I'd go in with I'd skip a pencil basically, and just use a lighter pressure. So I'm just working into this area here. using a light to medium pressure. Again, we're not worrying about those finer light hairs coming over the top, as we can add those in later on. Going back over it again with a slightly heavier pressure. And also working on this side using a slightly less pressure. And then working back in over this area here above the eye. Using the sharper side of my pencil as I bring out those strokes. Working into that shadowed area around the bridge of the nose. Again, kind of curving my pencil to create that fur going in different directions. Then to add a slight touch of that kind of blue, very light blue tone I can see in certain areas, so around this part here, maybe a little touch here and around the bridge of the nose. I'm using a light cobalt blue, and I'm only very lightly glazing over, because I only want to add a very slight hint of this colour. Bringing it up a little over the top. This just really enhances those cooler tones in the shadowed area, and then also here in the bridge of the nose. And then taking the silver grey pencil, which is kind of that, like that very light blue grey. I'm just working back into the fur, into those cooler areas. Pretty much covering the whole of this part here where the ear is at the top in the corner. And then around the corner of the eye here. Using more of a heavier pressure just to block that in there. Now we're starting to get a bit of structure around the eye. Just using this as a bit of a blender pencil into the bridge of the nose here. And then working back into this part here, I'm going to take a slightly darker warm grey pencil. This is the Warm Grey 273, so it's more of a mid-tone grey. And I've just given that a quick sharpen to start adding in some more precise details here in the inner corner of the eye where it's a little bit darker. So I'm creating some finer strokes coming up, following the direction of the fur. And I'm using more of a medium pressure and then flicking my pencil up, taking the pressure off a little as I do this. Bringing them up right from that inner corner there. And then around the bottom, going out to the side. And then it's slightly more cool toned as we come out there. And slightly more cool toned as we come out to this part. I'm just going to add a touch of that here. And then as I come around the top, you can see some warmer strands. It's kind of like a mix of warm and cool tones here. And then I'm just going to switch the paper and turn the paper around to the side, sorry, just to work from a different angle. Now I want to add some soft light pinks into the fur and back around the eye. So I'm going to use the Derwent Light Fast Salmon, which is a really nice kind of light pink. If you don't own this pencil, you could always use the Polychromos Beige Red. And I'm just working into those pink toned areas. So in the corner here where the ear is, just using a light to medium pressure. In the corner here, coming out from the eye. You can see a touch of that there and just above the eye there. Adding a slight touch here into the fur, but not too much. And then a very slight hint here. You can see some in the bridge of the nose there. Curving my pencil as I do this again. And then working into that area around the nose. And then also above here. And then for this shadowed area here, I can see some kind of like olive green yellow tones in there. So I'm going to use the olive brown 10%, which is nice and light. I'm just using a medium pressure to shade in there, to add in some of those warm kind of olive tones. And then I might also use the Luminance Middle Verdigris again, as I can really see some of those green tones coming through there. Taking the Middle Verdigris, I'm going over that shadowed area again, using a medium pressure to shade in, bringing it out a little into the white fur. And then also bringing it up slightly, taking the pressure off a bit here, so it's not quite as dark. And just adding a very slight hint of that around the top there. And then also in the centre, just kind of glazing over here and in the bridge of the nose. It's definitely more of a cooler tone in this area though. And a little around the top and back over this part here. Now taking a bit of a darker pencil, this is the Cold Grey 234. I'm going to start adding in some more precise strokes, and now I'm using a lighter pressure with this as it's a darker pencil, and I'm kind of just cutting into the lighter strands of fur, so those lighter areas, and I'm making sure I've got a sharpish pencil for this as I'm creating finer lines. But again, I'm not pressing on too hard as I don't want any harsh kind of dark grey in the fur. I'm just starting to add in those more precise details into the shadowed areas. And don't worry if it does look a little too dark, as we are going to add in some lighter hairs over the top. Also working into this area around the edge of the eye, corner. Just kind of creating soft strokes as we don't want any harsh markings. And then using a slightly heavier pressure around this part here where the inner part of the ear is, and also around the top of the eye, creating longer strokes. Again, keeping those very light areas free. And then working back into the inner corner where it's quite dark. And then working across, cutting into that lighter part where I can see some of those lighter hairs coming over the top. I'm just going to put this in my extender. Working around the bottom, keeping a lighter pressure. Creating a bit of a marking of where that shadowed area comes out from the nostril there. Although that's more of a warm tone, but I'm just going to quickly mark it out with that pencil, just so we have an idea of where it is. And then we can work on the nose afterwards. Kind of shading in here, so I'm going to be bringing out those lighter hairs over the top later on. I'm just going to shade in that top part of the eye so it's looking a bit grainy, just to create a bit more of a smoother shadow there. Around the bottom, creating a bit of a mark under that lower lid. Bringing out some of those strokes from that lower lid there, going across. Going back in with the silver grey pencil, I'm just working back into the lighter areas of the fur. Just kind of shading in here. I would say the lightest area where it's the most truest white is like this area here. So I can definitely see the kind of light blue, very light blue grey tones at the top here. So I'm kind of covering the majority of that area. But keeping that area free, the bottom there. Adding a layer of that over the nose. This is kind of like a cool tone underneath that pink. And then just to block in the nose, I'm going to use the Prisma Rose, Pink Rose, sorry. And I'm just shading in using a light to medium pressure, or a lighter pressure, just blocking in that nose there, so we have an idea of where it is. Now I do really love the Prisma Pinks, but if you don't own these pencils, I will give you some alternatives in the caption. Using the blush pink from the Prisma range, I'm just adding in a darker line there, and then also shading in around the nose, just adding a bit more definition to the nose there. And then using the Polychromos Burnt Carmine, I'm just going around the nostril, just so that we've got a bit of a outline around there. We don't lose sight of it as we keep building up those layers of detail. Shading down using a lighter pressure as we shade away from the nose. And then just going up the centre there. Using the Polychromos Dark Sepia, making sure my pencil's nice and sharp, I'm just working back around the details of the eye. So I'm working into that inner corner there. And then just going over that inner part of the eye with the burnt sienna 10%. And taking a slightly darker cold grey, cold grey 234, I'm just shading over that just to add a bit more shadow. Using a medium pressure there. Then going back in with the dark sepia pencil, just going around the top, just darkening that up a little. Around the edge, again. Adding in some darker strokes coming out from the corner, but using a lighter pressure, because I don't want any harsh dark lines. And also using this in the nostril just to add that darker shadow right under the nostril there. Then going back over those little details around the eye. Those little speckles of detail on the eyelid there, and then a little bit around the edge there as well, kind of creating little dots around the eyelid. Then going back in with the cinnamon pencil, I'm just going back over that just to add a bit more warmth coming out from the eyelid there. And then adding a touch in the inner corner there. And a little bit into this shadowed area, just bringing a little bit more warmth. And then also under this shadowed area in the nostril. And then also in the nose a little there. Taking an even lighter pink pencil, this is the Luminance Pink White. I'm just adding those slight hints of pink that I can see coming through the white part of the fur. So just above here, kind of shading in, using a medium to heavy pressure around this part here. And then around the nose. And the bridge of the nose. And then around the bottom. And then back around the eye. Taking the Paynes Grey 30%, again, I just want to really build up this cooler area in the shadowed part of the fur there. Using a medium to heavy pressure. Bringing it up slightly there, but taking the pressure off as I flick my pencil away up into the fur. And then using less of a pressure as I add some detailing here into the centre. And then working around the bridge of the nose. Curving my pencil. And then around the top. Quite a lot of those cooler tones here around the top part where the ear is, where the ear connects to the head. Before I continue with the fur, I just want to bring a bit more of that kind of green tone to the eye. So I'm using the middle verdigris, and I'm just adding a touch of that into the eye, just to bring back a bit of that kind of greeny blue turquoise type colour. I'm just using a light to medium pressure just to glaze over. And then taking the pressure off in that lighter area there. Then I'm using the Polychromos Earth Green just to add a touch of that as it's slightly darker. Just working into those darker areas. Can go back in and add in some darker details again afterwards. This might blend it out a little. Going back in with the Cold Grey 230. I'm just continuing to build up the fur. creating strokes as I do this. Don't forget we will be using the slice tool here, so we can bring in some lighter details over the top. Using a bit of a heavier pressure here to blend that darker area into the lighter part. Just pretty much shading in the whole of this area here. Using a bit of a heavier pressure. And also on this side here. Again, we'll bring in those lighter hairs going over the top of the slice tool afterwards. I just want a nice smooth base to layer on top of. And then I'm also doing the same with the warm grade 270, but working into those warmer areas. Again, I can use a bit of a heavier pressure as it's quite a light pencil. This area has that kind of mix of warm and cool tones. So I'm adding a bit of warmth there as it goes into the lighter part. Just kind of shading in rather than adding details. We will add in the detail with the slice tool, mostly. Using the burnt sienna 10%, I'm working back into this area around the bridge of the nose, using a light to medium pressure. Again, I'm kind of curving my pencil to create that look of the fur going in that kind of swirling in the different direction. And I'm only using a light to medium pressure as I just want to add that subtle hint of pink that I can see. And then working back around the areas of the eye, bringing a bit more of that pink tone going into the white part of the fur there. And then also in this ear. Again, we're not worrying about the lighter hairs at the minute. And then back around this shadowed area here to add a touch of warmth. And also into the nose. And around the bottom. Gradually bringing it into the lighter area. And then I think I'm going to take the Polychromos Light Magenta, as I feel like it matches that nose colour. I'm just using a lighter pressure just to add a touch of that. And then it's more peachy in certain areas around the nostril there. And then to just blend that out a little, I'm using the White Museum Acrowell, using a medium pressure just to blend those tones down a little. And then using the Warm Earth 40%, I'm just adding in that shadowed area around the bottom of the nostril. Above the nostril, sorry. And then also below the nostril. And just around the top. Using a light to medium pressure to blend that slightly into the nose. It's a little bit more out of focus here, so it's not quite as detailed as the eye area. And then going back in with the Prisma Blush Pink, I'm just using this around the bottom there, just to add a touch more pink, that true pink kind of tone. And then using the Burnt Sienna 50% from the Luminance range, I'm just working it into that middle part. Again, I'm not too fussed about having a super sharp pencil, because it's kind of out of focus, so we don't need to create any super detailed lines or details. And then under the nostril again. Sorry about my hand getting in the way here. I was just shading in just below the nostril. And then using the Caput Mortuum Violet just to work under that shadowed area there. Just focusing around the top rather than at the bottom and around the edge of the nose there. And then to buff it out a little, I'm using the Paynes Grey 30%. I'm just using that under the pink, darker pinks we just added, just to add kind of like a natural buff into the lighter part of the fur. As I can see, it's kind of like a cooler shadow underneath. Going into the fur there, around the edge. Now to add in some more precise details, I'm using the Warm Grey 273. Working back into this shadowed area again. And gradually coming up into the lighter parts. And I'm using a light to medium pressure, so I don't want to add any super dark lines. Although it is a little darker here, so I'm using slightly heavier pressure in this area where it goes into the ear. I'm just going to turn my paper around. Really building up the shadow around the nose here. Again, I prefer to make everything a little bit darker. And then when it comes to adding in the lighter strokes with the slice tool, it just makes it, just adds a bit more, just makes it easier basically to add those light hairs over the top if it's a little bit darker. It makes them more visible. And then again, to add a little bit of warmth, I'm using the raw umber 10%. To add a bit of warmth back into this area. Just using a light to medium pressure, more of a medium pressure to just shade in here. Glazing over this part, just to add little touches of warmth in areas. And now I think I'm going to take the slice tool to start adding in some of those lighter hairs. We can always go back in and add in some extra darker details around it, but I just want to start getting in some of those hairs over the top of the shadowed areas. So I'm just etching in, bringing my tool over the top of that darker area, and I'm creating nice long strokes with some of them overlapping each other. And kind of curving my pencil around as I come down here. I meant to say tool there instead of pencil. If you don't own the slice tool, you can always use a sharp white pencil to do this. But yeah, a slice tool is really helpful to create those super fine light hairs. And then it's a little bit softer as we come around the nose there. Bringing it up and cutting into those darker areas there around the corner of the eye. Again, bringing that towards the eye there. Just going to brush away some of that dust before I carry on. Bringing it over the top of that, of the ear, the inner part of the ear, and over the top of the eye. Again, overlapping some of those strokes. Now, annoyingly, my mic died here, so the voiceover's cut out just for a couple minutes. But I just continue to etch into the fur with the slice tool, and then I go in with the white Museum Aquarelle to go over some of those markings, as well as adding softer, lighter details to certain areas. So here I'm just going in with the white Museum Aquarelle pencil to soften and brighten some of those lighter details we added with the slice tool, making sure I have a sharp pencil at all times for this. Adding in those strokes going across into the corner of the eye here. giving my pencil a quick sharpen here as I'm going to be adding in some little hairs going over the top of that upper lid. And then I'm turning my paper around now to work on this area here around the centre of the head. Now I've just flipped my paper around and I'm going to continue working with the slice tool, working in this area here. Even though there's not as much darker areas to go over the top of, it'll still make that difference. And I'm just bringing them across that darker area there and down. Adding some over the top of that shadowed area. And then also here, although it's a little bit softer in this area here. Brushing away that pencil dust, and then go back in with the White Museum Acrowell. I'm just going to give that a quick sharpen. Again, working over the top of those lighter strands we just added, and softening this area here. Might need to go back in and add in some darker details in between the lighter strands there. Curving my pencil in this area around the bridge of the nose. And working back into the eye whilst I'm here, just to add a slight bit of lighter detail into this side. And then I'm going back in with the Polychromos black as the pupil was looking a little bit grainy. And I just want to neaten up the edges. Leaving that reflection around this part here. I'm just going around the top there. And then back around the edges of the eye using a lighter pressure. Taking the warm grey 273, I'm going back into this shadowed area. So I just really want to bring out that warm shadow again, as I feel like it's not quite as dark as I'd like it to be. I'm just using a light to medium pressure for this. And then I'm just going to turn my paper back around again to work from the side. I want to add a touch more warmth to the fur, so I'm going to use the Luminance Button Up. And I'm just going to lightly glaze over those areas I want to add a little bit more warmth to. Now this is quite a pigmented pencil. It's a bit more on the orange kind of creamy side, but because we've got quite a few layers down, I want it to show up, so this is why I'm using a bit of a darker warm pencil. But I'm just glazing over to add a touch of that warmth. Maybe I'll add a slight hint of Polychromos Ivory, which is a bit more of a subtle yellow tone. Just adding in those slight hints of warm yellow that I can see coming through. And a little down here around the nose. Going back to the eye, I'm using the Paynes grey pencil just to add a touch more colour to that shadow above the eye. Going back over those details just to define them a bit more over those veins, using a bit of a heavier pressure. Creating that darker detail. Around that reflection there as well. And then in between, just working, neatening up that reflection there. And then gradually shading in. And then back around the edge of the eye, just to darken it slightly. Then using the warm grey 273 we used earlier, I'm just working back in between those lighter strands we added, just to add a bit more of that kind of detailing in between, as we lost a bit of that when we added the lighter hairs with the slice tool. So I'm just bringing some of those back in, being careful not to go over those hairs we etched in. I'm working into this bridge of the nose here, just adding some slightly darker details. Curving my pencil as we come around the top here, and then up towards the top there. And then also around the bottom. I'm not using a heavy pressure with this pencil. Using the Cold Grey 231, I just want to add a touch more detail around the nose, this bridge of the nose area here. I'm just going to put that in my pencil extender. I'm just creating some strokes going up from the bridge of the nose and just adding a little bit more definition, although it is a little bit out of focus here, so we don't need to add too much detail. I just want to give a slight hint of first strokes there, just so it wasn't a patch of white space, and then I'm just blending that out from that darker area coming into that lighter part a bit, and then working up again into the centre of the face there. and adding a bit more of those strokes coming up. Creating slightly longer strokes as I come up here. And I'm just working back around the bottom of the eye, adding a bit more definition, bringing some more of those strokes, cutting into the lighter area and creating longer strokes here. And around the bridge of the nose there. Sorry, not the bridge of the nose, below the nose. And then going back to the eye for a moment, I just want to go back in with the Uni Posca pen just to brighten this a little bit more. Just going back over the top. And I actually just want to make it a little bit more blue toned actually. So I'm going to take the light Cobalt Turquoise, which we use for the iris, and I'm just going to very lightly glaze over. And that might actually get rid of that Posca pen we just added, but I just wanted to make it slightly more blue toned. And I'm using the dark indigo pencil just to neaten it up again. I'm gently shading into that reflection as it kind of buffs out into it a little there. And then I'm just going to neaten up the edge of it there. So it's slightly more square shaped and then rectangular as it comes up there. And then also working back around the pupil to add in some darker details, darker blue details. Then back around the top. Using the French Grey 30%, I'm just going back around the eye and the eyelid area just to make it a little bit darker. Using the Caput Mortuum Violet we used earlier for this part, I'm just going back over the eyelid just to darken it ever so slightly, but being careful to work in between those lighter hairs we brought down. Very lightly glazing over there, just to add a very slight hint of that pink tone, pinky brown tone, and then also in the inner corner, only very lightly glazing over there. And then I'm working back into that shadowed area around the nostril. And then I'm just going to turn my paper around again and just take one final look at it and see if there's any final details we need to add. Using the Cold Grey 231 pencil, I'm kind of just adding to this area here, shading in, just to smooth out that graininess and create a bit more of a smoother kind of transition. Shading up from the nose there, and also from this area here, still keeping those lighter areas free. Taking the Bernstein Eye 50%, I'm just gradually shading up from the bottom of the nose just to create a bit more of a shadowed effect so it isn't super cut off there and it's kind of fades into the nose. And then also on this side here. And then I'm using the burnt carmine just to go back up the centre over that line in the middle. And then I'm using the beige red from the Polychromos range just to buff that out and add a touch more of that peachy tone back into the nose. Keeping some of that lightness in the centre there. And then using the white Museum Aquarelle just to add a touch more lightness to this side and smooth down those layers. And then using the Sepia 10% just to buff out the shadowed area below the nostril there. And then also working back into this shadowed area to add a bit more of that grey-brown kind of tone. Adding a little bit of this in this area around the ear using the sharp side of the pencil. And then using the earth green from the Polychromos range, I'm just adding a touch more green into that shadowed area there. Then using the white Museum Aquarelle, making sure my pencil's nice and sharp, I'm just going back over these areas just to soften some of those strokes going into the shadowed area. Bringing some of them down into the eyelid area there. And this is just softening everything out a little, getting rid of those harsh markings. And also working into that shadowed area just to create a bit more, so it's not like a block of colour. We've got some of those lighter hairs coming through. And then also just shading in to this area here, but making sure to work in the direction of the fur. And I feel like I'm going to leave that there.
I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, I'd really appreciate if you could give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. I'll be sharing new videos regularly, so if you have any questions or there's anything you'd like to see as a future tutorial, just leave a comment below. And if you'd like access to over 100 real-time tutorials, you can also join me over on Patreon. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.